Okay, brief summary of chapter 3. The time traveler begins his story by describing in detail what the peculiar sensations of time travel were like. At the start, he is traveling approximately 1 day per minute, and by the end of his journey, that pace has increased to over 1 year a minute. But then he feels a kind of eternity of swaying in the machine, and the time traveler builds up the nerve to finally stop. The inertia being a scientific term for things in motion like to stay in motion, things at rest like to remain at rest. It's one of the fundamental laws of physics. I digress. When he stops the machine, he flies through the air and he finds himself amidst a terrible hailstone that soon stops and allows himself to get a better view of the future land. The first thing he sees is a giant structure. It's a statue that it's made out of marble and it's carved in the shape of a sphinx. Or it's got wings that are outspread. When the storm's over, excuse me, the people have noticed the appearance of this new outsider to their kingdom, and they come around for a closer inspection. The first to reach him is referred to as a man, as he describes as only being 4 feet tall. He's clad in a purple tunic, something that ancients would have worn, although it's set in the future, with some type of belt around the waistline. He said, "He struck me as being a beautiful and graceful creature, but indescribably frail. At the sight of him, I suddenly regained confidence." In next chapter, it's describing his first day in this year, 802,701. And the traveler, he meets these small, childlike surface creatures, which later will become referred to as the Eloi. His explorations lead him to discoveries such as the slight movement in the flow of the Thames River. He notes that there is no sense of family in the fact that there aren't any individual houses, and he begins to hypothesize about how society's been changed. He first speculates perhaps it accounts for the poor upkeep of the magnificent buildings is possible to this population growth explosion, and it worked out all too well and actually created a decrease in population. It's important to note that time traveling hints to us that there are many theories, but they're not true at all. He says, very simple was my explanation, implausible enough, as most wrong theories are. Again, it's not a prolific text. I mean, it is prolific in some ways, but the author is reminding us that these are just ideas, and they're not to be taken as truisms. I'm sorry if I'm seeming to fly through this, but with that 10-minute limit, as yet, we've only really met the narrator, the time traveler, and some of the minor characters, like the very young man, Blank Dash, Choice, the psychologist, and the medical man. We'll meet the others at the end of the story, as well as Weena will meet in the 5th chapter. However, I think it's important to note that the narrator the time traveler tells the narrator the story, and it's through the narrator that we learn about what's happening. It's curious to me why it begins only in the 1st and 2nd chapter and the final 2 chapters, and we'll discuss this more in class. Again, the majority of the novel is basically a recap of the time traveler's experience in the future. I think it's important that we discuss metaphor. We talked about this earlier in the year regarding figurative language, in the sense that a metaphor is the likening or the comparison of two seemingly dissimilar objects or ideas. In this case, in chapter 4, he is introduced to the White Sphinx. It's all in its glory. To him, he interprets it as some godlike being. Unlike the Sphinx, the normal Sphinx, he noted that there are wings that are outstretched like an angel. Now, he also interpreted that perhaps his eyes seem to follow him everywhere. And he makes some hypotheses that perhaps they practice a similar religion or faith or means of existence similar to the ancient Egyptians. We'll get into more metaphor analysis later. I think it's important that we should address the theme in the sense that as much as we haven't been introduced to the Morlocks yet, and the only first few Eloi We don't understand the class struggle and the means, actually, the struggle for survival that exists in the future between the Eloi and Morlocks. Certainly, the author is using some connotations with the word Eloi in the sense that it sounds like the word elite, describing the rich, the powerful, and yet there is a, well, I don't want to spoil the story for you, and it's going to be graphic. We need to remember that he was at a time, H.G. Wells that is, when societies around the world were suffering. And so the idea of communism was still stirring in the answer to class struggle. That's all I'm going to say on that note. Finally, I just want to give you a brief overview of his biography. Again, all writers are influenced by everything they're exposed to, and he came from a poor family. He, at one time, was a teacher, which he left to pursue writing. Given that the novel, The Time Machine, was such a huge success, he continued to write science fiction novels, including some of the classics as The Invisible Man, War of the Worlds, and The Island of Dr. Moreau. He did, in fact, marry another author, and as he aged, he wrote about the predictions about the end society. He had a curious mind, and we're going to explore that curious mind as we read something that was written over a century ago.